Rocky IV, Rocky vs. Drago, The Ultimate Director's Cut. Great, another unnecessarily long title. The director's cut of a film that is incredibly flawed, but still one that I very much enjoy watching. While many longtime Rocky fans consider Rocky IV to be their favorite because of its simple and straightforward yet inspiring story of Rocky avenging his fallen best friend Apollo Creed, it is also one of the most critically panned movies in the Rocky franchise, despite it being the most commercially successful Rocky film, grossing just over $300 million at the box office. While this version is only 2 minutes longer than the theatrical cut, the director's cut features over 40 minutes of new footage sprinkled throughout the film. Some changes are so subtle that casual audiences probably won't notice the difference, but other changes are so significant that they alter the course and emotional weight of the film. Stallone's backtrack to the editing room seems to have worked in the film's favor, with much of what worked in the theatrical cut gaining much more emphasis and a lot of what didn't work just being straight up cut out. My favorite additions to the film were absolutely the extra scenes of character development, particularly for Apollo Creed. Like the theatrical cut, this film opens with a recap of scenes from Rocky III, but whereas the theatrical cut opened with a recap of Balboa's victory over Clubber Lang, the director's cut opens with a recap of his earlier loss to Clubber Lang, and footage of a depressed Rocky throwing his helmet at a statue erected in his honor, which is then followed by the scene where Apollo finds Rocky at Mickey Goldmill's gym, where he tells Balboa to get back the eye of the tiger. The film then cuts to Balboa and Lang's second fight, in which Rocky claims victory. Usually, I'm not such a big fan of recaps of previous movies in sequels, and while this recap lasts a full 6 minutes, I'm okay with it because it reminds you of Balboa and Creed's friendship and sets up Apollo's death. On top of this, after the scene where Apollo watches a press conference from his swimming pool that introduces Ivan Drago, Rocky vs. Drago cuts to a new scene in which Rocky and Apollo have a conversation in Rocky's backyard. I like this scene a lot because it gives us a deeper look into Apollo's motivations for wanting to fight Drago in the first place. He hides his desire to be back in the ring with patriotism, accusing the Russians of coming to the USA to make them look bad, and even going as far as to accuse Ivan Drago's wife of using her husband as propaganda to win public favor with women. To add to that, in another new scene, Adrian says that she thinks Apollo fighting Drago would be a mistake, and points out that Apollo is really trying to reclaim the spotlight which he feels he lost after 5 years in retirement. These additions add a lot to Apollo Creed as a character. He wants the spotlight because he wants to feel like a warrior again. He truly feels alive in the ring, so when the Soviet Union enters the ring with their own fighter who supposedly is even stronger than Rocky Balboa, of course he's gonna jump at that chance for glory, because as Apollo says to Rocky, we're warriors, and without some war to fight, then the warrior may as well be dead. I love how that line foreshadows his death. The idea that Apollo feels the most alive when he's in the ring in a fight makes his death at the hands of Drago all the more tragic because he wants a fight, some kind of battle to win, which ultimately gets him killed. Speaking of tragedy, my favorite addition to Rocky IV is the extended funeral scene. Tony Burton as Duke gives a riveting speech about Apollo being a warrior, which pays off Apollo's speech to Rocky earlier in the film about being a warrior, and delivers it with such emotion that it almost brought me to tears. But the moment that broke me was Rocky's eulogy, where he acknowledges that his success at this point wouldn't be possible without Apollo, who believed in him when no one else would. And after breaking down into tears and telling Apollo that he really loved him, Balboa then places Creed's heavyweight championship belt on a bouquet of flowers. Sure, it's not the subtlest material in the world, but the emotional weight of the scene is momentous, and Stallone and Burton truly give it their all. I honestly don't know why the scene was cut down as much as it was in the first place. I would say that Rocky vs. Drago does a much better job at portraying the death of Apollo Creed and how that tragedy affected the other characters, particularly Rocky himself. The restored scenes that showcase their friendship makes Rocky's decision to surrender the heavyweight championship to fight Drago and avenge Creed even more emotionally impactful and endearing than it was in the theatrical cut. And overall, this cut does a much better job at selling me on Rocky and Creed's friendship. The deeper dive into Creed's motivations makes them feel more fleshed out and understandable than they are in the theatrical cut, which more or less glosses over these details in order to fast track to the action. The director's cut adds so much more humanity and heart to the characters that just wasn't there in the theatrical cut. Apollo isn't the only character that gets more time to shine in this cut. Rocky and Adrian's chat in the kitchen gives Adrian more agency, but I also really like the newly added added scene where Rocky and Adrian say farewell to each other before Rocky departs for Russia. It's a touching scene where Adrian asks Rocky to stay before Balboa says goodbye and leaves for Russia. It's a more emotional and moving scene, which works better for me than their silent and cold goodbye from the theatrical cut. Talia Shire's performance shines brighter in this cut, and these new scenes and small moments make Adrian's role in the film feel more substantial. It honestly really shows how underserved she was in the 1985 version, and how that version of the film critically misunderstood her role in this story, as well as her relationship with Rocky. I also love what was added to Ivan Drago's story. Drago isn't given much in the way of new material, but what is added fundamentally changed how I viewed this character. In the theatrical cut, Drago was portrayed as a seemingly emotionless and robotic monster. Here, like many of the characters in this film, he's given a fresh dose of humanity. For example, in the press conference scene in which Drago was previously silent, Drago actually speaks and says, "I did not come here to lose," making it evident that he takes Apollo's barrage of mockery and insults very seriously. There's also a great new moment where after Drago kills Apollo Creed, he declares, "Soon the whole world will know my name, Drago." Stallone also adds an insert showing Drago's handler Nikolai Kolob stopping in his tracks in response to Drago's declaration. This shows that the Russians never had the control over Ivan Drago that they thought they had, and that Ivan is actually a rogue who's in it for his own gain, which pays off later in his fight with Balboa when Drago doesn't listen to his trainers who criticize him for not following instructions, as well as when Drago grabs Kolob by the neck and literally tosses him aside. It adds a new layer to this beast who claims to fight for his own country but is really just doing it for the fame and glory, and is unwilling to listen to anyone, even his own trainers, which ultimately leads to his downfall. He feels less like a machine and more like a human pretending to be a machine, which I feel is a much more interesting interpretation of the character than the one we had before. There were a lot of things that didn't work for me about the theatrical cut, such as the lack of screen time and characterization for certain characters, the fast-paced story that glosses over a lot of the drama that made the first three films so engaging, and that fucking robot. But thankfully, a lot of that has either been greatly improved by the addition of new scenes and extensions to pre-existing scenes, and some stuff has just straight up been cut out. For example, the inclusion of a robot, Paulie's weird love story with said robot, and just anything to do with that fecking thing is gone. Thank you, Sylvester Stallone. Every decision with regards to cutting certain scenes, adding new scenes, and extending pre-existing scenes feels like it was executed with the intention of making a better film and improving on what was great about the first version. Having said that, the only new scene that feels a little tagged on to me is a scene where Rocky attends a board meeting with a group of boxing commissioners. I'm a little conflicted on the addition of this scene because on one hand it doesn't add much to the film, and in both versions of Rocky IV it is explained through dialogue that Rocky surrendered the heavyweight championship to fight Drago in Russia. But on the other hand, it does further emphasize what's at stake for Rocky by choosing to fight Drago and avenge his fallen friend. In that way, it does work, but I'm still not sure if its inclusion was entirely necessary. Much of what worked about the theatrical cut is present and still works just as well as it did in 1985. The synth score by Vince DiCola still kicks ass, the soundtrack is amazing, the MTV-style training montages are still exhilarating all these years later, the James Brown Living in America sequence is great, and Rocky and Drago's climactic fight is still as thrilling, intense, and fucking awesome as it was in the theatrical cut. However, one alteration to the ending really stuck out to me, and while I really like the original ending, this one just hits better for me because of this alteration. In the original version, after defeating Drago in the 15th round, Balboa acknowledges the crowd cheering for him and uses it as the basis for his "everybody can change" speech. In this version, not only does Stallone use entirely new takes of the speech, but he reframes Rocky's dialogue about the Russian audience cheering for him and makes the scene about Apollo. Rocky now says, "My best friend says people don't change. He died," before going into the "everybody can change" speech. To add to that, Rocky goes over to a defeated Drago and shows him respect, with the film closing with Survivor's "Eye of the Tiger" instead of "Hearts on Fire." By closing with the song "Eye of the Tiger," the film spiritually evokes Apollo as the reason Rocky did what he did, and I love that Rocky shows Drago respect, and how that contrasts with the disrespect that Apollo showed Drago. It just shows that Rocky wasn't as consumed by the need to be in the spotlight as Apollo was, which is shown by the fact that Apollo ruthlessly mocks Drago upon arrival and even made a whole show out of fighting him. This ending feels more subdued than the original. And while I love the emotional high of that ending, I also really appreciate the quietness of this ending and the silent acknowledgement of respect between Rocky and Drago because it brings their rivalry full circle. Well, at least it does for this point in the timeline. Rocky 4, Rocky vs. Drago, the Ultimate Director's Cut, that title, my days, makes numerous changes to the original theatrical version of Rocky 4, both big and small. But for the most part, the changes made improve on the film while retaining the best elements of that original cut. This is a version of the film with more character, more humanity, and more of the character-driven drama that made its predecessors and the movies to come after it so memorable. Well, most of them anyway. While its place in my ranking of the Rocky and Creed films is still debatable, after this director's cut, I can say that I'd rank it pretty high. It's a director's cut that truly feels like a director's cut, because it's far more concerned with making a better film than it is with adding extra minutes to its runtime, which makes for a much more interesting and enjoyable watch, while also vastly improving upon the theatrical cut. While the question of whether or not this is truly the ultimate director's cut is definitely up for debate, what I can say is that this movie truly recaptured the eye of the tiger.